Alright, peace and greetings, YouTubers. So initially, this specific conversation was going to be a segment in my last In the News video. However, I knew that I would make this segment way too long because I had too much to say. So I figured it could just be its own video. And pretty much, it's the conversation that everyone wants to continue to have in regards to the Michael Jackson vs. Beyonce comparisons that seem to always come and reemerge every few weeks. And mind you, this is a debate and a conversation that has pretty much been taking place for a lot of years, really. And the conversations go into many different realms where there wants to be conversations around impact or conversation around talent or conversation around who's more innovative, so on and so forth. And like I've always said, I just feel that there is a space for both artists to exist. We don't always have to make everything a comparison. But what triggered this current wave of debate is Jay-Z was in an interview and he pretty much talked about how, Michael Jackson is great and he's a legend, but he doesn't have a Coachella. And so that started a firestorm of controversy where everybody starts running and the fan bases are going in about this person. And well, they didn't do this and they didn't do that. And so what made it kind of crazy is, Beyonce's at home minding her business and, growing water. And now she's catching strays. Michael, God rest his soul, is, at a heavenly concert somewhere performing. And now he's catching strays from planet Earth. And so it's interesting because this conversation always pops up. And so I'll get to the conversation around Coachella a little bit later in the video. I just want to kind of have a music conversation. And so this specific video, I'm going to be honest, this is not about to be a video where I'm going to tear down the legacy of one to uplift the other, because that tends to be what everybody wants to do. But I just want to have an honest conversation about music. So if you would like to go on that journey with me, continue. If you feel like you need somebody else who's going to go and drag some folks, you can go ahead and turn this video off now. We're not doing that today. So anyway, what I've noticed in these conversations is that there's almost an obsession with wanting to replace the legacies of different artists. And this is not in response to Jay-Z. This is just in response to the entire conversation and debate in general. You know what I mean? There's always been a conversation for some reason, especially in the last 10 years, to want to replace somebody. Or, that idea of comparing artists from a parallel standpoint where you line up one artist here, you line up one artist there, and they have boxes to check. And whichever artist doesn't check enough boxes, this one's better. That's how the energy has become. And so you constantly hear narratives where this person is the new that. This person is this generation's that. And the issue I have with that is it creates a space where somebody always will end up in the shadow of somebody else. Or, an artist doesn't get the opportunity to really be an artist because their legacy gets watered down because they constantly have to be compared to somebody else, even if they're not even doing anything remotely close to what that other artist is doing. And the other dangers of when we put a parallel approach to comparing different artists when you just want to have a music conversation is it waters down their legacy. So an example, again, like let's use Beyonce and Michael as an example, right? Beyonce fans who have convinced themselves that she is the biggest thing ever, she is the god of music, they're going to constantly find flaws that exist within Michael's career to justify why Beyonce is Beyonce. And on the other end, Michael fans who feel that Michael is just, the epitome of music, they're going to constantly find flaws in everything in Beyonce's career that they can utilize to justify why she doesn't add up to what Michael has. And it becomes a thing where you chip away at the legacy of both artists. The whole argument is, on display for the world to see. And so you end up seeing, things that people deem as flaws with both artists over time. And before you know it, you can't even appreciate the artist in the same realm because people are constantly trying to find something to tear down. It's kind of like when you watch a concert clip or a music video on YouTube, there's always going to be those people in the comments section that rather than just enjoying that video for what it is, they got to compare them to somebody else and talk about this person could never do it like this and so on and so forth. It's kind of like there's just this obsession with wanting to make everything a comparison from a parallel standpoint. And I believe that if you want to make comparisons, it should come from a space where you're looking at artistry through a spectrum, and a spectrum that is not linear, where somebody doesn't have to be dependent upon another artist in order to have an impression. And so what I mean by that is when you look at things from a spectrum that is more so a web, it can highlight the things that an artist may shine in and highlight something that another artist may shine in. It can create a space where everybody doesn't have to measure up against each other, but you can just look at what it is somebody contributes and what it is that somebody else contributes and how they shine here, how somebody shines here, how somebody is really just the epitome of greatness here and somebody else may be, greatness there. It creates a space where you can have an honest dialogue and an honest appreciation for both of the artists or however many artists are a part of this conversation. And so I always say this, and I'm going to say it twice. What's Michael Jackson's is Michael Jackson's. What's Beyonce's is Beyonce's. And again, what's Michael Jackson's is Michael Jackson's. And what's Beyonce's is Beyonce's. I think a lot of times the issues you keep seeing with these arguments is like people want to almost erase the legacy of the other to gas up the other. So it becomes a debate about impact or talent or innovation. And I think when you want to have these nuanced conversations, there's a bunch of different things you can highlight with both artists that shine. And also, to be fair, some of these are also generational arguments. To be fair, like people are going to remember what they were raised on. And so if you weren't raised for a specific artist, you may not be as impressed with what they did because you weren't around during that era. You weren't around for the context of how the music industry was set up. And so you see things through a very 2021 lens, or you see things through a very 1978, 1981 lens because your standard for entertainment comes from a certain era in which you grew up. And then also, based on how you grow up and what you're into, it becomes your standard of measurement with how you see things. And speaking of standards of measurement, it's always funny because, no matter what people may want to say about a Michael Jackson, what's interesting is every time people start making comparisons, Michael Jackson is always the standard of measurement that people go up against. You can say what you want about Michael in regards to everything he's done, but when it starts coming to who's this, who's that, they always measure up against Michael Jackson. Like even the rapper, I forgot his name, but I just saw the viral post where he said, people compare me to Michael Jackson, and he was talking about the energy that exists at his concerts. Or even again, I remember what triggered a video that I made some years ago, which I'm actually about to reference. There was a conversation where it was like, The Weeknd is this generation's Michael Jackson, or The Weeknd is the next Michael Jackson, or even when Michael Jackson died, Justin Timberlake is the new king of pop, Usher is the new king. Like, it's always been that standard. And it's interesting because they even do it across gender. So even women entertainers that are having a great impact, automatically it goes straight to the Michael Jackson. And this is why I say, what's Michael's is Michael's, what's Beyonce's is Beyonce's. When we constantly try to put the two of them right here, now all of a sudden Beyonce can't exist as Beyonce, and Michael sometimes can't even exist as Michael because everybody wants to make these generational cross comparisons. And the reason I don't think that is fair is because, in my opinion, and I've said this before on another video, there are some artists that I believe were encapsulated into a perfect period of time for music in which the cards were just aligned so perfectly that they were able to do things that the artists before them couldn't do, and that the artists that came after them couldn't do as well. And in addition to that, there were things available to them that the artists before them didn't have, and that the artists that came after them didn't have. Those 6 artists, in my opinion, Michael Jackson, Prince, Whitney Houston, Janet, Madonna, and Mariah would come in at the tail end of that. And what I mean by that is there was a specific period in music where there were so many structural changes to the music industry, right? And so what ends up happening, we see the shift in how radio operates. During this time period, and I'm talking about the emergence of probably the mid 80s to about the mid to late 90s, and I reference those 6 because they're the ones that, in my opinion, are rooted in that specific era and were pretty much the most successful. But you see a shift in radio and how radio operates. And now there's a space where artists can get even more radio audience impressions than artists could 20 years earlier because we see the shifts that happen in FM radio stations. In addition to that, they start making genre-specific formats, which gives artists opportunities to even have a bigger appeal, because now not only can you just only be played on the R&B station, you can also be played on the top 40 station or the adult contemporary station or the golden old, like all these different stations. Remember, before the shift of radio from AM to FM, a lot of the radio shows were just top 40 and just top 40 blank. Whatever the top 40 was in America, that's what was on the radio, and that was it. As you shifted into the genre specific eras, now an artist that was specifically R&B, who may not necessarily always have a top 40 hit because it's not crossing over, now they can get a lot of shine in the urban AC format, or in the R&B format, or even in the rhythmic format, so on and so forth. So you see that shift with radio. Again, audience impressions get big and things shift, right? You also see the emergence of the importance of the music video, right? Music videos had been out since about the mid to late 70s, but most music videos were not presented the way that they were as you get into the MTV era, and especially with what Michael Jackson was able to do. When you go back to music videos in the past, and I said this in my last So It Happened episode, labels really weren't pressed about investing in music videos because a lot of people didn't really know how much of an impact it was going to have in the music industry. And at that point in time, radio was still the gold standard for promotion and getting your songs out there. And so when you had something like MTV emerge and even BET emerge, these weren't networks that were right across the board, just nationally available to everybody. One, you had to have cable, and two, even when cable emerged, cities got cable at different time periods. So there were people in the Midwest that had MTV almost a year and a half before New York City even had it. And so people didn't really invest in music videos. So a lot of music videos would tend to just be a performance video where the artist would just perform the song. Maybe they'd get footage from a concert, or maybe they'd go ahead and they'd go rent out a quick studio and it would show them with the band performing the song. That was the video. There were some music videos that did have a plot, or, there was something that, they'd be somewhat interesting to watch. But the idea of big budget videos with a full plot and themes and actually using movie directors to direct the videos. We didn't really start seeing that until after Michael Jackson started promoting the Thriller album, where you start seeing videos like a Beat It or a Billie Jean or a Thriller, and then later down the line you start to see the Madonna videos and the Janet videos and the standards for music videos became more intense. It became the new standard of how to entertain as MTV, BET, VH1 become these bigger outlets for exposure. And what I mean by that, like when we talk about things that were available to one group but weren't for the other, if you go back just 20 years, music videos weren't a thing. It wasn't like Billy Preston was going to have a video for Nothing from Nothing and he was going to be on the yacht with the dancers just busting it wide open. None of that was a thing. And so when you talk about promotion, the emergence of music videos to the point where they became almost a standard of marketing in conjunction with radio, that wasn't available in that time period before. And so you saw the emergence of music videos become literally a standard, right? And you saw music videos really start to carry a whole lot of weight, where now you need to have a music video to push your era. So again, for the artists who came before them, that wasn't available just because at that point in time, artists who were big in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even the 70s, their claim to fame really was about touring. They had to constantly stay on the road because, again, a lot of artists, there wasn't a lot of exposure on television because, again, award shows were kind of a little bit different. They weren't what they were now, but you'd have a few people perform here and there, but we know that performances at award shows are very different now than they were back then. And even shows like the Ed Sullivan Show, a lot of times if you were up and coming, it would be very, very hard to get on a show like that because you had to wait in line behind the people who were established. If you already didn't have a major industry connection, you weren't going to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, a show like American Bandstand might be a little bit more welcoming, but again, artists only had so many outlets for exposure. Fast forward to the era of when music videos become a thing. Now a random person in Oregon can just flip a channel and boom, here's some music video from some up and coming artist that maybe nobody's heard of, and that artist has not even toured yet and hasn't been to their town, but that person now hears that song and now they want to go get it. Because again, even when you talk performances, the standards of performances also would change during this period that I say like is the encapsulated era. Because again, a lot of performances back then that were for television, the idea was more so just to get the song heard so people would go and support it. It wasn't even about what they were doing on the stage. This is why so many of the shows that were from the 50s and the 60s and the early 70s, you saw a lot of lip syncing where they're literally just kind of miming to the album track and that's it. There's not going to be dancers and lasers and none of that stuff is there. It's just literally them. There would be some performers who would have more enhanced shows, like a Dionne Warwick. There's a really great performance of her performing Walk On By, and it has a whole theme. But you had to have some money behind you to do that. And so again, there's just these artists that I named. So it was Michael, Madonna, Janet, Whitney, Prince, Mariah. They come out of this era where there were things available to them that wasn't available to the previous generation. And the reason I say it's not available to the next generation is because music videos now have shifted form as far as exposure. MTV, BET, VH1, they're not outlets for marketing in regards to music anymore. And so things have shifted. And so in a world of a Beyonce, in a world of a Bruno Mars, their marketing approach is going to be different than the marketing approach of an artist that was out in the 80s and the 90s because things have shifted, all right? And so to go even further, because I don't want to just only make this about artists of the past, when I say that there are things that are available to a generation before and maybe or there are things that are available to a specific generation but not the generation before or the generation after, it even exists in today's time. So if we take an example of Beyonce when she released the self-titled album, right? In my opinion, the success behind that release was only something that was available to Beyonce. No one before then would have been able to pull that off based on the structures of the industry, and nobody would really be able to do it after. And this is why. The reason I say everything I say, if we go back, like who remembers that night? You remember it was the season finale of Scandal. We all just found out that Olivia Pope's dad was the dude in the limo. And then literally 10 minutes later, social media is blowing up because Beyonce just dropped an album, right? And not only that, it's like, oh my God, Beyonce dropped an album. And not only that, but it's a visual album and she has a music video for every song. And so when you talk about how huge that moment was, it was huge because one, social media made it huge because, hey, social media was not a thing 20, 30 years ago. Imagine, how do you drop a surprise album in the 1990s? iTunes doesn't exist yet. Streaming is not a thing yet. Social media is not a thing yet. This is when people still have to go to the store and buy an album. So let's just say, I don't know, Boyz II Men decided they're going to drop a surprise album in 1996. The only way people would have found out about the album is they would have gone to the store and saw that it was on the shelf while they went to the store to go pick up some I don't know, a book from Kmart. And they go, oh, Boyz II Men has an album. Then they go and call somebody, hey, Greg, did you know Boys the Men came out with an album today? Yeah, I'm about to buy it right now. Like, that would have been the attempt at trying to release a surprise album in 1996. It just wasn't going to have the same kind of impact. So when we talk about what was available at that moment in time, Beyonce at that moment in time, the caliber of success that she already had put her in a place where she could pretty much break the internet by doing so. And so with Beyonce doing that, that almost becomes a new standard of how people release their albums. But I don't think there will ever be another moment where another artist can drop a surprise album and it's going to carry the same weight that Beyonce's did when she dropped the self-titled album, because the cards were perfectly aligned. So anybody else who drops, a surprise album, they're going to always be compared to who? Beyonce, which goes back to what I was saying about how sometimes an artist can do something and literally it's for them. So another example would be like the national anthem, right? Many people have sang the national anthem before at many events, right? But everybody knows the go-to standard for the national anthem is Whitney Houston, right? Like I said, before Whitney Houston did hers, people still did them at sporting events. It would still be before the boxing match. It would be at different award shows, but the context of how everything was already set up and the way that the cards were aligned. We're coming out of the Gulf War. It's just a really, really awkward time politically. Whitney goes up there, kills that mess. And it's just the way that she delivers that song just connected with so many people, where the song becomes a hit. It charts. A performance at a Super Bowl halftime show of the national anthem charts. And so no matter how great people who came after have done their renditions of the national anthem, no one will ever give any other artist the same, standard and accolades that Whitney got for hers, because now Whitney's version is the standard. So again, Whitney's standard and what was available, it wasn't there for the people before Whitney did it the way she did it. And even the people who come after, no matter how great they do, it will never measure up to what Whitney did. So when I say what is for an artist is for an artist, that's what I mean. What's theirs is theirs. And so I think when we want to talk about legacies, we want to get into a place where you see the accolades or the things that come over time as more so an extension of a legacy that's already there. I personally feel that each generation paves a lane, right? They create a lane that creates a space where things can only get better for the next artist. And so, artists go through what they went through. So just like how we made the references to the ideas of music videos and everything like that, you have to think who decided to randomly start thinking of music videos. As people maybe got bored with what may have been happening in regards to marketing and music, somebody said maybe we should do things that are more visual, and it becomes a thing. And over time, now the idea of a music video is a thing. So I feel that artists, each generation creates something great. The next generation learns from that greatness. They continue that greatness and try to expand it into something even more. And it's not about replacing or being better than, but it's about recognizing that without the greatness that is this, we can't get to that. And so I don't like when people try to compare that to this, if that makes any sense. So here's an example of what I mean when I say recognizing that you're extending and enhancing a legacy and also creating your own lane while doing it. So there was an entertainer named Louis Jordan, right? Louis Jordan would be the person that would go on to influence James Brown, right? James Brown would go on to have this massive career, and what was James Brown's was James Brown's. It didn't mean that all of a sudden he's better than Louis Jordan because that's who he was influenced by and he replaced Louis Jordan. No, Louis Jordan was still going to be Louis Jordan, but James Brown is now James Brown. And James Brown became James Brown because of the greatness that is Louis Jordan. Then we get to the next level. Michael Jackson, right? Along with somebody like a James Brown and Sammy Davis Jr. and Jackie Wilson, these are the people that would inspire somebody like a Michael Jackson. So as Michael Jackson becomes Michael Jackson, it didn't turn into Michael Jackson is better than James Brown, he's better than Sammy Davis Jr., he's better than Jackie Wilson. People saw it as, because of how great those three were, they were able to inspire him to be great. They were great enough to inspire him to do things that no one had really quite done yet, or to do things that maybe had been a different approach than what people were used to. And it doesn't mean that because Michael Jackson was able to do all these things that people hadn't seen before, that automatically it negates what it was that the other three were able to do in regards to music and impact and influence and innovativeness. It just means that without those elements that they had, it wouldn't create a space where Michael Jackson could be a Michael Jackson. It's kind of like the idea of a 4x4 relay race, where you have four people and they do the full 400. Like, you know what I mean? If you're that last person in the race and you win the race, how did you win the race? You ran the race, or you won the race because the first three were able to get you to where you needed to be. Even if one of the second or the third leg fell behind a little bit and somebody else got in front of them, they still got to a place where when it got to that fourth person, they were able to have enough momentum to win the race. You know what I mean? If you were to take that fourth person and make them do all 4 laps by themselves, they're not going to win. You know what I mean? And so, long story short, it's just highlighting the fact that, yes, as time progresses, we're going to see so many new things that are really great and innovative, and a lot of it comes from the influence that the greats before them had. So I think you have to get out of a place of always wanting to replace and compare. Now, getting to Coachella, because I know this has been a long segment, but I really enjoy these music conversations. I really do. And so when you get to Jay-Z's statement where he says, yes, Michael Jackson is a legend and he's great, but he doesn't have a Coachella. And I think the issue I took with how that argument was approached was it almost came off as if because Coachella was such a great show, it negates and eclipses anything Michael's ever done. Therefore, Michael is no longer part of the conversation and we will center everything on Beyonce from this day forward. That's kind of the energy that kind of came out, and people kind of took that same approach and ran with it. And I'll be honest, if you want to have a conversation about whether or not Michael Jackson has a Coachella, I actually agree with Jay-Z in the standpoint where I don't think Michael has a Coachella, but I'm looking at it from the standpoint of how the Coachella show was structured. When you look at the Coachella show, you know, it's pretty much centered around a full-out marching band, like this very HBCU-influenced marching band. Because I remember when I first saw the show, I initially thought the band was going to be there for the first 1 or 2 songs, and then they would dip on out, and the stage would transform, and you would kind of get what you would normally expect from a Beyonce show. But no, the band was extremely pivotal into the show, where all of these members of the band, they're up front, they are a part of the show. You have the majorettes doing this, that, and the third. You have the drum majors doing this. And then Beyonce still also has additional band members that are not part of a traditional marching band in there. So you got somebody like Ariel O'Neal on the guitars and all these other different people. And the show is just very unapologetically black. And if we want to be honest, I don't think people realize there's a lot of work that goes into directing a marching band. You know, it's like 60 plus people in this band, right? And it's not like they're just doing a song or two, because yes, other entertainers have used marching bands before. It's no secret, but you haven't seen it in a space where it's a full out 2-hour concert where everything is infused to also correlate with what it is that somebody like Beyonce is doing as an artist, where, you know, you have this R&B rooted pop superstar that, you know, has this entire catalog in which the band has been able to successfully translate all of that music exceptionally well on top of whatever else is great with the show. So in that respect, yeah, I don't think Michael has a Coachella, but it doesn't negate or take away from anything else that Michael has also done, because if we go tit for tat with who doesn't have what, we'd be here all day. So I think you can give people their flowers, but sometimes give people their flowers without trying to, you know, almost diss somebody else or make it seem like, well, you know, well, they didn't do that, do this or do that. Because at the end of the day, I look at Coachella, again, like an extension of the legacies that have been created for many entertainers who came before Beyonce. Because think about it. If you're an entertainer in 2021, what hasn't been done at this point? The greats from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and 90s and even the early 2000s have done any and everything under the sun. I mean, Michael Jackson literally had a man in a jetpack flying out of the stadium. That way he could kind of trick the fans into thinking that Michael flew out of the stadium. So while they're watching the man in the jetpack fly around, Michael's already on a tour bus getting up out of there, because they know that it's about to be 200,000 people blocking the streets trying to get to his hotel. Like, everything has been done on the stage. And so it creates a space where newer artists have to constantly think outside of the box in order to continue to elevate higher as entertainers. And I think Beyonce was aware of that. And so for Beyonce, who is now, this is pretty much a comeback performance. You know, she had to go on pause. She has just had twins. She's gotten older. There's newer entertainers that have come up and come out, and people are starting to try to somewhat write Beyonce out. And so boom, Beyonce said, I got to show y'all something. Y'all not about to count me out right now. And so boom, this is, you know, the epitome of her comeback show. So good for her. So I agree. I don't think Michael has that specific show, but there's other things that Michael has that I don't think anybody will ever capture. So I think we can look at this argument from a space where we can actually enjoy and embrace the greatness that is both of Michael Jackson and both of Beyonce. I don't like the idea of comparing things cross-generationally, because just like we said with the relay race, that's exactly how I kind of look at something like even a Coachella. But like when Jay-Z does something like comparing standards of 2021 to the standards of 1987, I just don't think it's a fair comparison. The same way Billboard, in my opinion, I think they should start making a distinction in regards to the accolades that they announce when different entertainers, especially in 2021, 2022, break certain records. And that's because the music industry in 2021 is very different than the music industry of 1990. You know what I mean? And what I mean by that is this. When you talk about music, there was the physical era. Physical era pretty much ran until about 2001. Physical era, people have to go to the store, buy the albums and everything else like that. And so that's how you pretty much calculated the success. In addition to that, even the way that radio was calculated when you talk about hits, there was a difference. More emphasis was put on the impact of radio, and as well as the impact of the sale of the physical single. So you have the physical era. Then you have what you call the combination of the physical and the digital era. iTunes emerges, Amazon emerges, and so people are still going to the stores and buying physical albums, but you can now also purchase on iTunes and on digital platforms. And so there's still a balance where a lot of people are still buying physical albums, but people are also purchasing on iTunes or Amazon. Then you have what you call what we're in now, which is the streaming era. Or even before you get into the streaming era, then there's kind of like that pre-combination of everything where you have the remnants of what's left of the physical era because more people are now pretty much doing digital. Digital is the bread and butter of album sales at the moment. And some people have been introduced to streaming. So you had some services like Rhapsody come out back in the day. It didn't really catch on. And then you see the emergence of Spotify and Apple Music and Tidal and all of those things. And so you have like that tail end of what would be the physical, the digital, and the streaming. And now we've kind of shifted into more of a pretty much a streaming and digital, and that's pretty much where we're at. And that's why even when you look at the release of albums, they'll say, okay, this is what they had in SPS sales, this is what they had in pure sales. When they say pure sales, they're talking about these are the sales that where people actually went and purchased. The rest of these sales are calculated through streams. And the thing with the conversation around streams is that it's still a challenge to really equate streams to physical album sales, because really the conversation is about revenue with how many streams. And so the threshold of measurement continues to change with streaming. And so, you know, it's a very interesting little concept. Getting back to Coachella, to me, Coachella represents progress over time with lessons learned. Going right back to what I said about the 4x4. Coachella is such an epic and eventful show because there's just so many great elements to it. And I'll get to that in a second. But again, some people wanted to make the conversation around impact of Coachella and say, well, you know, Michael never had that moment. But if we're talking impact, I don't think that's a fair comparison because, okay, if we want to talk numbers, all right, we could just use something like Michael Jackson's Motown 25. Do I think you can put it in a room with Coachella as far as structure of the show? No, because I think they're very different. And I think, again, they exist in a spectrum where there's a certain element to one and there's a certain element to the other. But when we just talk impact for a second in regards to something like, you know, Motown 25 versus Coachella. Now, mind you, Coachella was very successful, all right? You had like 458,000 people stream it as it aired. And so far, I think there's been 41 million people to view it. It was a very massive success in modern times. Motown 25, right? Just to put things into context, if we want to make this argument about impact, I'm not even talking about structure of the show, but impact, right? It airs on like May 16th of 1983. At that point in time, Michael Jackson's Thriller had already been #1 on the Billboard 200 for 12 straight weeks. Okay, Michael was pretty much calling the shots. He was just killing it, right? So he does Motown 25. You know, you see him did the moonwalk and it's the Billie Jean and everything. And before people try to come in here and argue, well, he stole the moonwalk. Listen, Michael Jackson has been very open with the fact that, yes, Jeffrey Daniels from Shalimar did introduce him to the moonwalk, but Michael Jackson is the one to help popularize it. So that's where the conversation should go. But anyway, so he was already #1 for 12 weeks, right? And Thriller had been #1 at that point since February of 1983. Motown 25 happens in May. Thriller goes on to be #1 for like another 25 weeks. Just week after week after week. Like Thriller would go on to be #1 until April of 1984. Okay, it spent 37 straight weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200. Just 37 straight weeks. Nobody broke that time in between. It was consecutive. It was to the point where you didn't even have to look at Billboard magazine. You already knew who was going to be sitting at the top of the charts because that's the kind of impact a performance like that had. Now, what would continue to carry on that impact would be the fact that Michael would go on to release the Thriller video in the fall of 1983. That would kind of give the album some more legs. But again, impact. Like, I don't think people understand that. Like, even the success that Michael had then, like how we said things are kind of in that encapsulated space, something like that is not available now to an artist in 2021. Times have just shifted. The industry is a different space. It's a different place. You know what I mean? And so, again, when you saw something like that Motown 25 performance, it pretty much became what would be the new standard of performing for the next 20 years, where now we're going to shift from, you know, just the singing, but it's going to be more of a visual. It's going to start to become a spectacle with the singing in conjunction. And we fast forward and you start to see shows start to emerge. Because if we want to be honest, Motown 25 is actually a very stripped down performance for somebody like a Michael Jackson, but it's seen as his breakout performance. And I think that's the reason why it's always held as such an iconic moment. Just think about it. This is a performance that's probably about 40 years old, but it's often cited as one of the greatest performances on television. Why? Look at the context of what was happening in the world at that time. Billie Jean had already been #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 7 weeks, on top of the fact that the album had already been #1 for the 12 weeks. And, you know, he had just performed with the brothers and they did the final set, and now he's on his solo trip. And the thing that made it interesting is people already knew Michael Jackson was a dynamic performer, especially people who had been following him since childhood. But as he got older and you saw him in the Jackson tours, where you talk about the Destiny tour or the Triumph tour, people were like, have you seen that kid Michael Jackson? Like, he's one to watch. And so I think that performance at Motown 25 represents what was to come. And everybody in that venue knew about it. Like, everybody knew what was to come. And it just symbolized what would be next. It's a combination of the standard of what was already acceptable and a combination of what would be the future. And so that's how I look at something like a Motown 25. So when we get to something like a Coachella, in an ideal world, that Coachella performance should now be the standard of how other entertainers entertain. However, it's not an ideal world, and the music industry sucks, so other artists will never have that same kind of investment. What you see with something like Coachella is, one, in addition to the fact that Beyonce is just extremely talented, because she had been in the industry for 20 years and had created pretty much an empire for herself, she got into a space where she could create something that literally only she could do in that moment in time in respect to how the industry was set up. And so, like we said with Motown 25, it kind of shifted and created a standard of how entertainers would have to start performing from now on, because now you're going to start seeing that shift where people put a little bit more into their visual performances. What makes something like Coachella great is, one, in addition to the vocals, in addition to the musical arrangements, which I absolutely love. Like, when you just notice and pay attention to some of the things that were there, like, some songs would be lowered half a key or a different key just so you could transition it into the next song and everything like that. The theme, the costuming, I love the unapologetic blackness of it all. And really, it's just almost like a celebration of black culture. To me, it represents the modern experience of where we are today. And I think she did an amazing job of capturing that. And for me, Coachella falls in line with a lot of my other favorite performances. Like, everybody knows, I'm a big Janet Jackson fan. The Velvet Rope Tour is my pinnacle of entertainment. Like, that is my go-to concert for everything. I get the same excitement about that tour that I did when I saw it when I was like 8 or 9 years old. It still just shakes me, right? And so, and in addition to that, like, I'm obsessed with the Wembley shows that Luther Vandross had. I love Michael Jackson's Bad Tour, especially the early leg, the Japanese leg. I really love that. There's just a rawness to it that exists. The Whitney Houston Welcome Home Heroes concert, as well as the Bodyguard Tour from Brazil. I love that show. Even in modern times, I really enjoy Shaka Khan's home concert. It aired on TV, I think last year maybe. There's just a bunch of different shows that I really, really enjoy, where to me they're like the pinnacle of just great entertainment. But again, all of those different shows would help to set standards for what would be expected for later artists to come. Like, another example would be even when you go back to award shows, right? Diana Ross at the Oscars. There's an Oscar award ceremony where she performs Do You Know Where You're Going To from Mahogany, right? And so she's actually not at the venue. She's doing it via satellite from Amsterdam. That would be one of the first times you see an entertainer perform via satellite for a live award show in the United States. That may not sound like a big deal, but let's talk about what happens at award shows now. It's very common that an artist can be on tour and they'll, stream in, via satellite, and here's the award show performance. Even in the modern times of COVID, where a lot of award shows, we weren't in a capacity to have in-person award shows, we're now in a space where artists can literally perform at a studio hangar nearby and mail the performance in. And now technology has changed where that can be a standard, where you can have an entertainer perform at an award show where they're physically not even present. So that's what I'm talking about when I say things become a standard. And for me, because Coachella is such a great show in regards to musicality, I would hope sometimes that more entertainers would have that same approach with performances. But again, the industry is structured so different, and it's not about talent anymore. It's more so about how much money we can bring in, who has the most social media clout, who can be the top trending topic for the moment. And that's kind of where the industry has shifted. But to get to the conversation about comparisons between Coachella and something Michael Jackson could do. So when we talk about Coachella, the show, one of the things I think people have to remember is it was a stationary show because it was for a festival. It didn't have to travel. So because it was going to be in one location, there's a foundation or a home base where everything is located. There's so much more you can invest into it because you don't have to move this big giant production anywhere. And so it's kind of like when you see people who have a Vegas residency, right? A lot of times, if you've seen a lot of these new residencies in Vegas, the shows are extremely elaborate in comparison to what some artists may do when they go on tour, because now that they don't have to worry about trying to ship things and do all this and they're kind of in one location, they can really just put all of the effort into one specific show. And when I think of Michael Jackson, I don't remember him as a solo artist doing any festivals. And honestly, to be honest, his tours in itself were a festival with some of them audiences. And speaking of tours, I do wish when people have the conversations about touring revenue and success, I think more people should focus on how many butts were in the seats. You know, because there's some artists who have astronomically high ticket prices, and there's some who have more reasonable ticket prices. And I think when you want to talk about the success of a tour, yes, revenue is important, but how many people went? How many times did they sell out the same city? How many times did they have to revisit a city on a second or third or fourth leg because there was that much demand? I feel like sometimes that's left out of the conversation and everything is only centered on the money. And now in modern times where a lot of energy goes into the merch sale, because really that's really the cash grab right now, I think it just kind of shifts things. Because, you know, you go back to the 60s and the 70s, there were concert tickets that were like $6 and $7. And sometimes I don't think it's fair that we compare, you know, what was going on then to what's going on now. Also, Polestar doesn't always release everybody's information, and sometimes people will make entire articles and reports about the success of a tour based on limited information. They don't have the box score numbers of every city. They only got them from 10 cities, and somehow they're gonna say, you know, a tour that had 200 shows only grossed $30 million. That don't add up. Anyway, but going back to Coachella, what made Coachella such a great show was so much was invested into the show. Like, literally, picture her trying to take this show on tour. First of all, Coachella had a 64-piece band. 64-piece band, all right? Just like one, Coachella, if it were a tour, would be a very expensive tour to try to push and pull. Because again, you have a 64-piece band that you have to pay for. These people have to get paid a well enough living where they can sustain and pay their rent and everything else, or mortgages. You have to pay everybody who's going to take down and put together the set every night. You're going to have to pay the people who are managing the tech and the lighting and all the graphics that go on the screen and everything like that. You're going to have to pay the people who do the set design, that pretty much create the set before you go on tour. You got to pay for the hotel accommodations for everybody that would be on this tour, all of the crew, all of the band members, everything, all right? You got to pay to feed everybody. You have to pay for the travel, and in some moments there's going to be days where people are on planes, sometimes they're on the bus, and in addition to travel, you have to move the equipment. Sometimes you can put some of the stuff in the plane, other times some things have to be put on the ship, and sometimes you got to put stuff on the ship weeks before the next show is supposed to take off because it's going to take a minute for stuff to get there, all right? And then there's the insurance. Because when you go on tour, there's so many things you have to insure. One, you have to insure the artist. You know, if something happens to the artist and, you know, they can't do the show and now the promoter's out of money, this is where that insurance claim comes in, so they don't have to pay for the lost wages from that show. But in addition to that, you also have to pay insurance for even the equipment. I don't know, something happens and all the band's instruments get stolen. All of that has to be insured. Even the venue, you have to pay for the event insurance. I don't know, you had some pyrotechnics and somehow you done burned down Madison Square Garden. Now you got to pay for it. That has to be insured, all right? Like, there's so many things that have to be insured. You're talking about the legal policy that exists with going into different countries and what the rules are in regards to taxation and commerce. Like, all of those things that you have to literally think about, all right? If Beyonce wanted to have the same camera work that she had for Coachella, you're going to have to pay all of those different cameramen because that tour was filmed with a bunch of different cameramen and special equipment as well. You also have to pay pretty much the sound people. Like, if you want the sound to be exactly how people heard it in the venue, there's people that are going to be working sound and the equipment behind the scenes. And then even the clothing. Yes, people are going to have wardrobe changes, but a lot of times when people go on tour, they have multiple versions or copies of that same outfit because the last thing you want to do, you're on town or you're going on tour and you have the white gown and 5 minutes before the show somebody spills some red wine on it. That's okay, go get the other one, we'll put this in the cleaners. So you're paying for all of the clothing, and you still got to pay the stylist who's going to be managing and working the clothing, and their assistants who are going to be making sure everything is washed. You got to have medics come on the tour and everything just in case somebody gets sick on the plane or on the bus, so on and so forth. You have the electricians that you have to bring who understand the different standards as you go into different countries. Because remember, I think it was Nicki Minaj who was on tour, and there were a few dates that she either had to postpone or cancel because she was pretty much stating that the electronics were not compatible with the electronic standards that were in some countries. That was pretty much what she was saying. You got to pay attention to all of those different things. And then, listen, if you got dancers, you got to pay them. There's so many things that you have to pay for. So something as big as Coachella, I don't think the industry is in a space where they would support Beyonce if she wanted to do it. And so, again, yes, Michael doesn't have a Coachella, but I don't think that automatically would eclipse and negate his experience. I think both can exist. Beyonce can have this great moment of Coachella, and Michael can have his. And again, I think we have to get out of the space of always trying to compare. And then even when you go deeper, when we just talk about technology, you know, staging and shows have changed so much. Just like we talked about Diana Ross earlier with being via satellite. Think about how different award shows are now than they were in the 70s and early 80s. You go back to some of those award shows, they literally stand in front of a curtain, sing the song, get off the stage, and everybody would applaud, and that's the show. Today, I mean, they got water coming out of the floor and all these different LED screens and different lasers and holograms and pyrotechnics this, and the bands can do, like, there's so much that has changed. And so I think you have to think about a lot of things. That's also one of the things that makes Coachella really great. Like, in my opinion, it's one of the few shows I've been able to see where it really feels like you're there as far as the sound. Like, you got to think, for years, people have been working on how to properly display the sound at shows so you can hear what the people hear. Think about like when you go to a concert and you have a really great time and the concert's awesome, and then maybe you play back the clips you have in your phone and you're like, I don't remember it sounding like that. Or you watch somebody's concert tour on YouTube, like from, fan footage, and you were there and now you're watching the same show, but it comes off so different. Like, you know what I mean? It's been years of research into figuring out how to present that in a way where you as the viewer hears what the people at the venue hear. That's been an ongoing progress, or a process. Even that's why so many shows from the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s have all been remastered to kind of have a better job of capturing that sound. Like, technology has changed, and the same thing again, like we said, with the visuals. Like, shows are just very different. Here's an example. I'm gonna use I'll use Janet again. So again, like, if you just look at the difference between something like the Rhythm Nation tour and the Janet tour, and I'm just talking the band, so much changed in just those 3 years, right? So with the Rhythm Nation tour, it's a very raw show. It's the band has to play everything. There are no pre-recorded musical tracks to help enhance anything. It's all raw, and it's a very raw show. Fast forward 3 years, technology had already changed to the point where now, things are a bit more digitized. And so somebody like Janet, who has a lot of songs that are very layered and stacked vocally, you can't pull that off with 3 background singers and Janet. Sometimes you're going to need that enhancement. And so if you've ever listened to like a Janet Jackson a cappella of a song like If, or Doesn't Really Matter, or I don't know, Miss You Much, and you just listen to the stems, like you hear so many tracks of stacked vocals to build that sound. Same thing with somebody like a Brandy, she does that as well, or even Mariah. But again, you get to 93, you get to that Janet tour, technology has shifted. So now they can enhance and add in the additional stacks to coincide with what the supporting vocalists are going to do and what Janet is going to be doing. In addition to the music, now you have a space where artists can also include musical tracks that will go with what the band is playing. So you can capture those extra sound effects and those extra things that maybe you can't capture because you don't want to pay for 5 or 6 additional band members to go with the 8-piece band you already have. And it gets further, because then when we fast forward into later times, now one of the popular trends in music is a lot of artists also have a DJ that will go with their live band. Like, an example I thought of, when Madonna went on the Sticky and Sweet tour, I think the highlight of that show is when she performs music. So on that tour, she remixes every song. Like, every song is remixed to a way to kind of fit for 2008, 2009. But with music, I think the reason why that song sounded so great in that show is because, in addition to the greatness of her band, you have a DJ that's doing, like, he has the spin equipment and everything else like that, and there's a lot of programming and other things that they can add to enhance the sound and make it sound even better. So something like what she did with music in 2008, 2009, she wouldn't have been able to do in 2000, 2001 when the song initially came out. And so again, you just continue to see a shift, right? It's even kind of like the Super Bowl, right? Like, look at how great Beyonce's Super Bowl performances were, but in addition to how great she is on stage, look at what changed in technology. She's on there with like holograms and all these different things, and then you go back, let's talk about how great Michael's Super Bowl was. Michael's Super Bowl was the standard for the year in which he performed it. Before he did it, the Super Bowl halftime show wasn't even a big deal. Nobody cared. You know what I mean? It was kind of, a lot of times it'd be like a marching band or something. Michael does it, and now it's a pinnacle of entertainment, and now that's like the main stage every artist wants to get on. And as technology would change, the shows get better over time. And so again, you just see how, as things progress and as technology gets better, shows get better. So when we talk about the fact that, as things progress, people have learned from whatever took place in the past and use it as a reference to build upon. And so that's why I think it's dangerous when you constantly want to do this parallel comparison and chip away what one artist did and what one artist didn't do. That's why I say, do the spectrum, where you can celebrate something without having to compare it to something else. So like I've said a handful of times in this video, what's for Michael Jackson is for Michael Jackson. What's for Beyonce is for Beyonce. What's theirs is theirs. Let them have what it is that they've built for themselves. I think when we get into the space where we can just celebrate and appreciate their contributions, we can look at them as actual artists and not try to look at them as a standard of measurement against the other. And so I think one of the setbacks that affect somebody like a Beyonce is the fact that from the minute she emerged as a solo artist, she was marketed as a legend. From day one, Beyonce was pushed out there as a legend. She was never pushed as the next this or the next that. She was pushed as Beyonce. What am I saying? This is what I'm saying. When somebody like a Sierra came out, right? People would say, okay, she's kind of like the next Aaliyah, kind of like the next Janet, or even Britney Spears. She's kind of like the next Janet, next Madonna type thing. Usher or Chris Brown, okay, they're kind of like the next Michael. Toni Braxton, she's kind of like the next Anita Baker. Jennifer Hudson, okay, she's gonna be kind of like the next Whitney Houston. Kendrick Lamar, people were like, oh, he's gonna be like the next Tupac. I don't think there was ever anybody you could specifically measure Beyonce up to because Beyonce was so different when she came out. Because again, in my opinion, Beyonce comes out of the school of five. Who's in that five? Tina Turner, Diana Ross, Janet, Whitney, Michael. That's who I see as her main influences, right? And so because those are her influences, and because you can't necessarily just kind of measure her up to one because her career doesn't really parallel with any of theirs, they all have something different, but you can see elements of all of them in her to some extent. I think, unfortunately for her, she has to always measure herself up against the highest of standards, in my opinion. Because again, when you push somebody out and market them as a legend from day one, those who come from an earlier generation that are already loyal to the legends of the earlier generations are always going to look at Beyonce like, okay, I mean, she cool, but I mean, so what I mean, and what I mean by that is this, right? So if we talk about Diana Ross, when people want to talk about the comparisons with Beyonce and Diana, sometimes the conversation is around kind of like the glamour, the image, the essence that is Diana Ross. If you weren't around, you wouldn't understand. But and because I was one of the same people, like I didn't understand how deep this was until I took my godmom to see Diana in concert like a year or two ago. And literally, Diana would get a standing ovation just for the outfit she was wearing. Because again, when you talk about the glamour and the image, and Diana was an icon in the 70s and even the 60s. But I think the 70s is like that peak of, oh my God, it's Diana Ross. And so like, as she would come out, every time she'd come out with this extravagant Diana-esque outfit, people would just start standing and clapping, and she didn't even have to sing. She just stood there, oh my God, Diana, oh my. And it was so crazy because the whole crowd is like 50, 60, 70 years old, and it was like you almost saw them morph into being 17-year-olds again. Like there was adults in there crying, and everybody was dressed like they were going to the Oscars. Like even the way people came to the concert, they were in furs, and this was at the Kennedy Center. Like everybody came like it was like this regal event, because again, it's almost like everybody understood the essence of what it was in regards to image of Diana Ross in the 70s or even the 80s. Like when you talk about something like the Central Park concert, right? And so there's that element. So when people want to talk about Beyonce and the conversation of measurement in regards to glamour and essence and all that stuff, people are like, but she ain't no Diana Ross, all right? And so Beyonce's gonna be Beyonce, but they're like, oh no, she's not Diana Ross. Or even if we talk Tina Turner, right? Tina Turner's known for being unapologetically Tina on stage, just the grit. She can get on that stage and just get down and dirty, just get nasty, and she can be on there with nothing but a band full of men and command the whole stage and work a full stadium of 200,000 people like it's nothing, even at the age of like 70. Yeah, I think that's how old she was on the last tour, right? And so when people make the comparisons to Beyonce with Tina Turner, they'll say, I mean, she's great, but she ain't no Tina Turner because this is how Tina used to do it. And, Tina Turner just had this grit and could growl, and sometimes she didn't even need the microphone. Her voice would just carry across the whole stadium, Or if you watch when Tina runs across that big thing that hangs over the stage and there's not even a harness, and she does it in like the high heels, like people eat it up. And so, again, it's kind of like, yeah, Beyonce has the grit, but she ain't Tina. And then you often hear people try to say, well, Beyonce can't sing. I think Trick Daddy had just did this whole spiel about how Beyonce can't sing. And who did they measure her up to right off the bat? Whitney Houston, who, in my opinion, in modern times is the pinnacle of who you want to study as a vocalist. You know what I mean? So when people make the comparisons about whether Beyonce can sing or not, the person she gets measured up against is Whitney Houston. And it doesn't mean that Beyonce can't sing, but like Whitney Houston is like from another planet in regards to what it is that she can do vocally. But again, automatically, Beyonce, when we want to have the conversation around singing, automatically she gets measured up to Whitney Houston. When we talk about impact, because Michael Jackson is the biggest act out of all these five that we've named, automatically Michael Jackson is the standard of measurement. And so no matter how many great things and somebody like Beyonce will accomplish, automatically people will be like, oh, she ain't did like what does she have a Thriller? No. Does she even have a Bad? No. Does she even have a Dangerous? And I'm talking album sales, not quality of the album. They're like, no, she ain't got that. Did her tour have a lottery that you had to go into just to get to the show? I'm talking about the Victory Tour and everything else like that. They'll latch onto every accolade that Michael has, and now in order for Beyonce to be a part of that conversation, she has to go box by box and measure up to every single accolade that somebody like a Michael Jackson has, which to me is like, dang, that ain't even fair, y'all. And then even when we talk choreography, and yes, Beyonce dances on stage, but automatically they'll say, yeah, she can dance, but she's not like a Janet when it comes to choreography. She can't do that nunchuck thing Janet does on Rhythm Nation. She's not going to do the Miss You Much chair routine. She's not going to do this. She's not going to do that. So when you look at the 5 people and who she's measured up against, Diana, Tina, Michael, Whitney, Janet, those are acts that I consider to be pretty much the top tier pinnacle of the lane in which they're respected in. Like the best of the best in their respective lane. And so for Beyonce, she has to measure against all of that just to be a part of the conversation and check off all those boxes. And I feel like that's something that only happens to Beyonce. And it comes because, again, her team, which I thought was brilliant, they pushed and marketed her as a legend. Just think about how Beyonce was introduced to us, okay? So yeah, Work It Out didn't really catch on, but we get to Crazy in Love. Like even just the words you read, it just let us know that we were about to get something great. When you look at the tours, especially the Beyonce Experience, just the title alone, the Beyonce Experience, it's letting you know you're about to get something great. And when the show opens, she just stands there and the fire falls down. And, there's all these things that just really push her to be Beyonce. So I think for a lot of people who felt that the industry was already shifting anyway, and you started to see a lot of veterans kind of fall off anyway, and the new generation was emerging, a lot of people already had their reservations to begin with, and they felt that if she couldn't match up to those reservations, then it's no good. But what sucks is it only happens to her, because again, let's go to like 2007 to about 2016. Who was the main person Beyonce was constantly compared to because they were having a huge career at that same time period? Rihanna, right? But what's interesting is Rihanna never had to measure up to any of those standards. Why? Because when Rihanna was introduced, she was not introduced to us as a legend. They pushed her as, okay, this is the cute girl next door that's from the Caribbean. They try to do like the real exotic thing. So when you listen to like the first album, it's a very dance hall reggae approach. Even the unreleased tracks, songs like Bring It Back and stuff like that, very dance hall, very reggae. Once they realized that they could push her as a successful pop star that crosses over, she became a bigger entertainer. But she never had to be measured up to the standards that somebody like a Beyonce had to. She got the luxury to do whatever she wanted and become Rihanna, right? So in my opinion, and this is not to tear down or make comparisons, but in my opinion, I think they are very, very different artists. And in reality, if there's anybody Rihanna had to be compared to, it was who? Beyonce. You know what I mean? So it goes back to that conversation of, again, those legacies that get extended and carried on. But the difference was, Rihanna, in my opinion, is not an artist like Beyonce is an artist. Rihanna has her own lane in which she's kind of created a new wave of entertainment that specifically is for a different kind of set of entertainers that have a different set of standards compared to somebody like Beyonce who has hers. I see Beyonce as a more traditional approach of what we've seen in music from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, as far as what it is that she presents on a stage. Like, in my honest opinion, and again, I'm not trying to come after anybody, but I feel like when you go to a Rihanna concert, you go to a Rihanna concert because you're going to have a good time. You're going to like all the songs. It's going to be a really fun time. Visually, it's going to be great. And you go home. And it was a great time. Hey, you go to that Rihanna show, it was lit, right? You go to a Beyonce show, you're going to go there expecting, these top-notch vocals, and you're going to want to see the dancers and the pyrotechnics, and she better come down from the roof, and there's all these things that you're going to want. And so, again, you see the difference in how both were approached. Rihanna's still going to get her criticisms, but it's not coming from a place where she has to measure up against Michael or some of the other greats that came before. And going back to the thing where people say, like, she can't sing, like, it makes me think, because, again, I think they only do that to her. Because, again, like, Jasmine Sullivan, in my opinion, I think she's one of the best vocalists we have out at the moment. There's just so many things that she can do with her voice, and she has the power and range to do so that it really makes her stand out amongst her peers. And what makes it even funnier, like even when you take little Jasmine, like 11 or 12-year-old Jasmine, and there's that clip of her performing Home from the Wiz, there are grown adults who can't even master the performance the way that she did. And so what you will never hear is, you'll never hear people say, well, Jasmine Sullivan can't sing because they try to measure her up against a Whitney Houston. One, they have two very different voices. Jasmine has a different tone, a different texture. She's also an alto, which means that her range is going to be different than Whitney's. And also, please get out of the habit of thinking that if somebody's not a soprano, it means that they're a weaker singer. Recognize that altos can really carry a song. And the gift that altos have is they have the best of both worlds in regards to how low they can go. And they have a comfortable chest voice in the higher ranges. A lot of times sopranos struggle a little bit to go further into the lower notes. But anyway, no one goes out of their way to say Jasmine Sullivan can't sing because, if you put her in a room with Whitney Houston, they're going to have two very different kind of vocal abilities. No one's going to say Jasmine can't sing. And I think that's because, again, when Jasmine entered the industry, she was celebrated. There was the comparisons of Lauryn Hill, and there was also the hype around her being a songwriter. But I don't think Jasmine got the luxury to come into this industry as a legend and seen as the best of the best. And so she ended up becoming someone who had the freedom artistically to just be herself without having to be measured up against anyone else. I think there were other fan bases of different artists that may have felt some kind of way as she emerged, but she still was her own entity. And that's pretty much the point that I'm getting at in regards to some of the critiques Beyonce may get as a vocalist. I just think because Beyonce already is such a huge entertainer, it opens her up to be in a space where there's going to be more criticism that comes. And that comes with the territory for any kind of artist that's big or successful in any of their lanes. I think even Michael Jackson kind of dealt with a lot of backlash and criticisms, especially after he was deemed the king of pop. People are like, king of pop. Now all of a sudden people want him to actually go and prove that. You know what I mean? Like the bigger you become, the more vulnerable you become to what you would call like criticisms and attacks, because now people really want to find something flawed within the greatness that you may be. And so that's kind of what we've seen, because even with Michael, now you kind of hear, even in modern times, people say, well, Michael Jackson couldn't sing. And most of the time, those viewpoints come from the fact that people root, I guess, what they would call Michael Jackson's vocal ability. They base it on everything from 1990 onward. So they will ignore the young adult Michael Jackson. They're going to ignore Moving Violation Michael, or Destiny, or Triumph, or Off the Wall. You know, they ignore all of the vocal ability that took place then. And then even when you just look at a group like the Jacksons or the Jackson 5, like, they're very underrated as a vocal, as a group in regards to vocals. Mainly because you often really celebrated their showmanship, but vocally, they were an amazing group. So again, I think when people pushed her out to be a legend from day one, it automatically set the bar so high where Beyonce had to spend years climbing to get there. I do think in this modern day and time, people respect her a lot more now than they did even during her peak. And when I'm saying peak, I'm talking album sales. Some of y'all gonna come fight me. She's still in the peak. Okay, cool, whatever. But I think people respect her now because I think by the time you start getting into 4 or the Beyonce album Lemonade, people really started to see like, okay, she really has done a lot. But I think it took years for her to get there because they brought her in on such a high pedestal as far as how they wanted to push her, and everybody hadn't been convinced yet. So Beyonce had to work for years to get people to be convinced. And now Beyonce's in a space where she can do what she wants and people can finally appreciate her. But I think that's why it's dangerous to have a space where we make these parallel comparisons, where you measure somebody up against the other. Because an artist can never really truly just enjoy the space that they're in as an artist, because you want to always make them be somebody else. You want to make them equate to what somebody else did. When we talk talent and music, all of that is subjective. It's all about how people perceive things, how people receive things, what works, what doesn't, and it's a conversation of creativity and innovation. So that's why I don't like the idea of always comparing everybody from a parallel standpoint. A perfect example of this, I've used her a few times in this video, but I think Janet is an example of somebody who constantly is compared in a space of a parallel. And on one side is Michael, on the other is Madonna. And so this is what I mean. I think Janet is somebody that a lot of people don't have a respect for as an artist. And it's because, one, what may have been the best thing to ever happen to her, but also could be the worst, is the fact that her brother is Michael Jackson. The best thing is, yes, it opens doors. It allowed her to get into a space where she could really build a great career and do her own thing. But the worst thing also meant that, hey, her brother is freaking Michael Jackson. And so for a lot of people who may not follow her, no matter what accolades she's created, there's always going to be somebody, well, she ain't Michael, right off the bat, ignoring whatever it is that she's done, right? All just kind of dismissing her. And people who tend to be critics or who may have not even been a fan from day one will not take note of the fact that she has her own set of accolades that she's established for herself. All of that gets blown out the window because she's not Michael Jackson. On the other side, the conversation around Madonna. And really, I think that only comes because Madonna is the more popular artist. I don't really see a lot of similarities between them, aside from the fact that they're both visual entertainers, and you don't really see them as top-tier powerhouse vocalists. You more so see them as people who had a magical way of introducing music to audiences through different channels that will kind of connect and kind of be long-lasting. But again, Janet unfortunately sits in this parallel where on one side is Madonna, who is by Billboard stats the most successful female entertainer of all time, and then on the other side is the brother Michael Jackson. And so for Janet, for all of the #1 albums and #1 singles, and it's interesting because even like her #1 singles are all solo. They're not even collaborations. It's just Beyonce, it's just Janet by herself. And some of the accolades she has, for a lot of people on the outside looking in, who cares? And that's why I think it's dangerous to kind of have that parallel comparison, because you can almost erase some people out of the picture. And I think that's also why when they start having these big conversations about women in music, she's often left out sometimes. And it's not even just her, it's a lot of other entertainers. But I think if we get into a space where you look at things from that spectrum as opposed to a parallel and making people try to check off boxes, it puts us in a space where you can appreciate all the artists. And then also just recognizing that some arguments are generational. So in some moments, there are moments where you weren't around, and no matter how much Wikipedia and YouTube you dive through, you still weren't around to experience certain eras. So it's in poor taste to try to erase something that you weren't there for. Anyway, this was a fun conversation. Share your 2 cents. I'm out. Subscribe.
This is the album where I try to give a taste about the past. All the lessons on relationships and bonds that didn't last. On the gas every foot, so she said I move too fast. Gonna crash in a place where there's nothing but the masses judging. Comes up with a picture, push me to the curb, but she finds another mister. Cut him to the edges of the heart and gotta find another victim. She dissed him, was good and now she missed him. Come on. Pick up the pace.